Good evening, everyone. Hello, I think we should, 7 o'clock, I think we should start the meeting. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Planning Advisory Committee meeting. We have two reports to consider, and that's in agenda item number 7 and item number 8. But just before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this meeting will be live streamed, and please use the microphones when you speak. Moving on to the agenda, item number 1. Are there any apologies for absence and substitution? I've been informed that Councillor Conti is substituting for Councillor Young. Are there any? No? Okay. Okay, moving on to item number 2. Are there any urgent matters? No. Moving on to item number 3. Are there any declarations of interest? Moving on to item number 4. Are there any matters to be considered in private? Okay. Thank you. Moving on to item number 5. Are the minutes of the meeting held on 15th of November 2023 agreed as a correct record of the meeting?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Item number 6 is regarding the terms of reference for this committee. I hope all of you have read the agenda, pages 15 to 18. Now, also, I'd like to talk about what this committee could do in the future. So I'd like to ask some questions. Are there any topics that the committee are interested in exploring in the future? Because obviously this is a new committee and it is worth considering that do we have anything we would like to explore in the future? Councillor Wall? Yeah.
We're obviously doing the Future London Plan. It's probably too early to start looking at the future Ealing Plan, but we'll have Reg 19 and whatever fallout from that, or not, as the case may be. So, you know, that'll be something we'll look at, I'm sure. And certainly, I think I don't know if it's on the agenda actually. I didn't get to the bottom, but planning stats, etc., and how we're doing, how we're performing as you know, as an organisation. Are we doing well compared to the rest of London, the rest of the country? I think we are. We think we are, but it's always worth, you know, checking. And this is sort of committee, I think, could probably take those sort of wider discussions rather than the planning committee.
Thank you, Councillor Wall. Councillor Mahmood.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations to you on your first meeting, and I'm sure all the best for the future. I'm just wondering if you could cover topic like two things. One is, I'm just thinking about that. What would be the future of Greenbelt in London Borough of Ealing? And because there is lots of local development plans are coming, for example, London Plan as well. And we just wanted to make sure the future London Plan will be embedded with our own local development plan. So that sort of things we need to think on the future.
Thank you, Councillor Mahmood, and that is noted. Also, are there any particular stakeholders the committee would like to invite for future discussions or contributions? So stakeholders for future discussion or contribution. Councillor Conti.
I just want to see resident associations across the borough often, resident associations across the borough often obviously get very involved with local planning applications of their area. Obviously the borough covers a large area. I don't know whether some form of representation from local residents groups, in particular associations, or maybe even the Ealing Civic Society, who I know often comment on applications, might be sort of stakeholder that might be worth approaching.
Councillor Wall.
We have a community advisory panel and a review panel and a design review panel. So both of those, community and design, I wonder if either chairs of those or representatives of those may or may not want to come and either ongoingly or intermittently come and tell us how they're doing, how they're getting on, or any questions for us, or etc. So it might be a time to interact with them, because we don't really.
Thank you, Councillor Wall. Councillor Conti.
Sorry, just it came to my mind after when Council was speaking. Conservation areas obviously are an important part of sort of the planning process, and how sort of the rules apply to those. And often there's often sort of challenges, in particular when it comes to things like the green agenda with solar panels and other things in terms of things to make homes more energy efficient. I just wonder whether looking at that as an item, but also I know there's a new conservation officer as part of the planning team, whether maybe they could come and maybe present about what their work they're doing in sort of in that regard.
Thank you, Councillor Conti. Anyone else? Okay, moving on to item number 7. That's the main 7 and 8 are the main items of the agenda. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Peters, who is the Assistant Director for Planning and Design and Sustainability. She's the lead speaker today. And I'd also like to welcome Steve Barton, the Strategic Planning Manager. So I'm now going to hand over to Jennifer Peter, who will present the report for item number 7.
Thank you, Chair. So just a bit of background. The Towards the London Plan was published document was published in May, and it basically sets a discussion of what the new London Plan will include or might not include, could include. Unfortunately, the deadline for comments was on Sunday, so this discussion won't inform our response because we've had to send that in, but it's still, because it's such an important document in the way that it guides development across London, it's still important to consider it, and there'll be another opportunity once it's actually a draft to feed in. But also, I imagine over the next few months there'll be various discussions and opportunities to give our views, so in that sense it's useful. So I've been a bit cheeky here, and the slides I'm using are actually the GLA slides. So I thought it was a good, it sort of provides their view of what the important things are in the document, and we'll go through these and then we can have a bit of a discussion. So I'll just go quickly. There's just a little bit of an overview of the timeline there of what they've been doing. So for the last few years, they've actually been doing quite a lot of discussion and engagement with various stakeholders and communities throughout London about the London Plan and what it should include in the future. They've done this Towards document that's out now, and that will feed into a draft London Plan at some point next year. And then it will go to examination in public, and they're planning for adoption in 2028. And it's quite important, the timings, because as the London Plan, as you probably know, is part of every borough's development plan, and it's important that it sort of remains up to date. So the current London Plan was adopted in 2021, so they kind of need to get it adopted quite quickly, otherwise it will start falling out of date. And we understand that they are talking to government about transitional arrangements and making sure that boroughs aren't left without kind of that cover, particularly when it comes to things like housing targets, which we'll talk about in a second. So the document itself, it's not a draft plan, it's quite clear about that. It's more a kind of discursive document, a bit similar to an issues and options document you might do at a local authority level. And what they're saying is, you know, that they're posing questions and trying to ensure that they have that discussion. They're keen to say that it also might not include not everything in it will necessarily be the mayor's preferred approach, but they want to gather feedback and views on it. And they've also tried to feed into those questions what they've learned through that engagement and discussion they've done over the last couple of years. They flagged that it's a difficult delivery environment, and those of you who are kind of involved in the planning committee will know that it's been a bit of a slowdown in development recently. Developers are finding it harder to deliver for a whole range of reasons, but they're obviously kind of cognizant of that, particularly with the government's house building targets, which we'll also come on to. Because of that, they've made this point about the London Plan not increasing burden on development overall. It's difficult to tell whether that's the case or not, depending on what the final sort of policies are, but it's interesting that they've put that as kind of one of their key, or one of their aims. Just on the kind of, won't go through all the mayors forward, but the key thing to pick out there, I think, is that it makes the point that housing and economy are important, and just sort of a sneak kind of preview of one of the things that we've raised as West London and also Ealing in responses to this is that we don't feel it's quite done that. The economy still doesn't really come out as important as housing, and particularly we want to make sure that the importance of West London economy to London comes out in a new London plan. But this point around the housing numbers, so the government's given a figure through their standard method calculation of 880,000 homes over 10 years for London, so 88,000 a year, which, considering the current London plan has 52,000 homes a year in it, it's a massive figure. Now, in previous times, I guess when different colours of government and mayor, the mayor wouldn't always have agreed to that kind of figure, but it's been very clear in that document that's the figure that we're going for, understanding that ambition and the wider ambition across England. So they're looking at how we can deliver and find capacity for those kind of numbers. So it's making the best use of land, increasing densities. It will mean that each borough's housing targets will go up. I think we can guarantee that pretty much. And they're having to look at, even though they're looking at brownfield first, they are having to look at other places for development. So they are looking at Greenbelt, and they are looking at working with government on the kind of new towns idea as well. So that's going to be quite fundamental to how kind of all the different boroughs in London grow in the future. So I guess, just setting out here, they make that point around there are some difficult choices, which we always know through planning, as we were in our examination last week having these kind of debates. So there are always difficult choices and balance of kind of priorities, and that's what they're trying to discuss in the document. So they talk about the progress on the current plan. That's a key diagram. You can't really see it very well there, but it kind of sets out where you've got the growth corridors and the development. They've talked about whether that's the right approach or do we need to reframe it. They talk a lot in the document around, even though they don't necessarily use the phrase, but the kind of polycentric development, that we've got to not just focus on the central activities zone, but we want development across London, particularly kind of employment opportunities. And obviously there's things that have been delivered over the kind of course of the last few London plans, like the Elizabeth line that we know ourselves has completely sort of changed the landscape in terms of development opportunities. And there's future opportunities like that in other areas of London, such as the Bakerloo line. So the housing challenge, I think, is probably the biggest challenge within the plan. The London plan will set the borough targets. So we're going through that process at the moment, looking at kind of what capacity we have in the borough. And then, as I mentioned, the GLA are doing a Greenbelt review as well, which will also feed into their thinking. So you will have heard about the Grey Belt, which is a national designation, which is kind of what you test whether Greenbelt meets certain criteria, and if it doesn't, and it doesn't have other designations, then it can be seen as Grey Belt and therefore potential for development, which is obviously a massive change to where we were in the current London plan, which says kind of pretty much no development on Greenbelt or metropolitan open land. They've been more clear about metropolitan open land in that they want to protect that, and that's not being reviewed, but they do say something about golf courses, which is quite interesting, and that they might be in the mix for kind of future development. They look at, they're reviewing, or they've talked about the affordable housing thresholds. At the moment in the London plan, it's the 35%. If you get to 35%, then you don't have to go down the viability tested route if you can't get to 35%, you do. They talk about mix of tenures, which is also relevant to the next item as well, like bringing more build to rent into the market. And they talk about student accommodation and co-living and how that can contribute or how it should be managed. And we know in Ealing we're seeing a lot of applications for those particular uses. And although it meets a need, there is some questions about whether it is meeting need in the right way. And it also talks about ensuring that we provide for gypsies and travellers and travelling show people and older persons' houses, all the different specialist accommodation. So as mentioned, with economy, they talk about that it has a dual priority with housing. I would sort of question whether it does read like that in the document, but it's good that they're making that point. Obviously, the central activity zone remains a focus, so that's kind of the City of London and satellite of the kind of Isle of Dogs, Canary Wharf. But they're also talking about kind of having a look at the boundaries of CAS and looking more at specialist clusters, both inside and outside the CAS. Also looking at kind of how town centres can deliver both for employment but and also for commercial use, housing uses as well. And also looking at kind of where we could probably deliver more housing in town centres. Industrial is obviously really important. The last London plan helped us kind of in Ealing, but also across London, retain more industrial land because there was a lot of pressure on industrial land for housing. And now it's it's important that we do maintain that and retain it for the functioning of London, but also looking at how we can perhaps deliver more or do swaps in terms of making sure that the industrial is in the right location and can perhaps open up opportunities for other development. And also the point around light industrial can be sort of carried out in lots of places, so it could even be in town centres. An issue that's mentioned there, but I don't think it actually comes out that detailed in the document, is about data centres. We're seeing a lot of interest in data centres in the borough at the moment, so they have real implications for our land use, but also, as we know, energy, but also opportunities in terms of wasted heat and heat networks. So it's quite a sort of new area that we probably want the London plan to look at in a strategic way. Talks about hotels and visitor accommodation. It's sort of talking about being fairly flexible on that. I think it's interesting again for us because we've seen a lot more hotels over the last few years, and I guess there's again a question about, is there a tipping point when too many, or where they should be focused. Just double checking if there's anything to mention there. Yeah, in terms of skills, ensuring that we kind of capture the skills and development that we often do through our applications, but perhaps do that on a London-wide way. So then another interesting area is around kind of scale and density. So they're kind of looking at the current London plan. You'll know kind of asks boroughs to define what a tall building is and set where in the borough that tall buildings are acceptable. They're kind of perhaps re-looking at that, maybe suggesting that the London plan should take more of a role in identifying where that height should be. So should there be specific clusters or particular areas that take heights? They talk there about potentially having kind of not kind of minimum heights as such, but encouraging kind of higher density development where it can be appropriate. Talk about a London-wide design code for small site intensification. Lewisham and Croydon have both done kind of the Croydon one I don't think is current anymore, but have both done guidance documents to try and encourage the right type of development to come forward on small sites, and that is a place that's potentially untapped intensification across London, but it does have obviously implications on places and how they feel and the infrastructure needed. Makes the point about needing transport infrastructure to unlock densities, and that's an issue across London. And they're also sort of talking about potentially making sure that the housing targets are linked to that investment happening, so you don't have a situation where you end up with all the houses but not the transport investment. So it'd be interesting to see if they can do that, and whether they should do more or less on heritage within the London plan, and also look at how we can retrofit heritage buildings to be better for the environment, etc. And then there's sort of some specific things here. Heat risk, we obviously know that's an issue over the last few weeks, making sure whether the London Plan should say something specific on that, or should it be left to kind of national policy and or building regs. And we know that the government are talking about national development management policies. So if they're a lot of stuff set out at the national level, then the London Plan would need to cover it. An interesting one, I think, for the density discussion is around kind of homes for families and whether how you make sure that they're the right designed well, flats are designed well for families in mind and has the right open space, etc., play space, amenity space. Talks about wheelchair housing, again, sort of specialist housing, making sure that we deliver for those needs. And just generally that inclusive design, which London Plan has been quite good at, ensuring that we're child friendly, that we design for all kind of all Londoners' needs. And then just on infrastructure, climate change and resilience, I mean, it mentions here about environmental policies and potentially whether you leave to the national regime or keep. I think the London Plan's done a lot in pushing forward both regional and national policy on kind of zero carbon and energy standards, etc. So I think it would be a shame if they left it to national policy, if I'm honest. They've done a lot of work on heat networks within other teams within the GLA, and it would be good to, as we're seeing kind of the data centres potential coming forward in our area, how we can tap into heat networks and wasted heat. So I think that's again a new area that we need to make sure that everyone's capturing. Open space, I think, is particularly important when there's also the discussion about how we deal with green belt and particularly delivering more housing or development on green belt across London. So how do we make sure we have the open space that we need, particularly given kind of more people, more development, and balancing those. And then it talks about the urban green factor and the fact that we've got a biodiversity net gain as well, and kind of working with those to make sure that we're delivering that kind of environmental improvements to areas when development happens. Parking standards, always a very interesting and topical debate. So the London Plan very much focuses on a kind of car-free approach where possible, depending on where you are in terms of transport accessibility. So they're looking at whether they need to relook at those, you know, go further on that. And then obviously EV charging is pretty important, has a big link to energy requirements as well. Fire safety has been picked up much further at the national level since the last London Plan was drafted. So you've got the health and safety, so building safety regulator now, and the gateway processes. So that may mean that the London Plan doesn't need to say so much on that. Air quality, the air quality positive has been a kind of introduced in the last plan. So they're talking about what more they can do on that. And then cooling down and how we can have created cooler spaces, again, particularly relevant this week and the last week. But this is an area that kind of, again, we've mentioned within our response about needing to plan for a resilient city, and that we need to be thinking about those different climates in everything we do now. So it needs to be fundamental. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah. So hopefully that's just kind of an overview. And as I say, they are the GLA slides. So they're the things that they felt were the most important to bring out.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, if I can. Any questions? Okay, if I can ask Councillor Nija, please.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview, Jennifer. 2 questions from me. The first one is sort of around the key risks for us as a borough if we can't meet our share of the increased targets, so particularly in terms of speculative development and, you know, potentially loss of planning control. And the second question, you sort of touched upon this, but if you could perhaps elaborate a bit more on the local transportation point. So how are we going to ensure that local transportation and health infrastructure keeps pace with the proposed scale of growth? I know you said it sort of goes hand in hand, but I think, yeah, if we could have a bit more detail on the thinking behind that, that would be quite useful. Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, I mean on the so in the development of the London plan, boroughs play a role in that to an extent in terms of kind of working on housing numbers and what capacity that each local authority has got, but that's within the confines of what the London plan's kind of policy or methodology is. I think it is a really good question because there's two different things. There's a capacity point, which we may be able to identify a certain amount of capacity, but as we're seeing now, even with our current London plan target, actual delivery is a different thing, and we have very little control over that. So I think that is an area that kind of we are concerned about, because if our target goes up, which as we say probably will, and actually the next item around kind of speeding up build out is sort of linked, but there does need to be a kind of stepping up from developers to actually deliver that. And the point you raise is right. If at the moment nationally there's what's called the delivery test, which means if we don't meet a certain proportion of our target over a kind of rolling 3 years, then we kind of get penalised. So first of all, you have to do an action plan, then you have to sometimes find more you have to find a buffer in your housing land supply, and then the final one is you become what's called in the presumption, which means you're in the presumption of sustainable development. So some of your policies have less weight, and you have to provide that importance of delivery becomes more important in the committee's kind of discussion and the officers' decisions around applications. So I think there is a potential risk if we get a housing target that's not really deliverable, but I think that's a risk for London, and so it's something that the Mayor of London and nationally they'll really have to think about, because it's almost a bit chicken egg, isn't it? You need the planning system and the planning documents to plan for a big amount of development if that's what you want to happen, but then you also need those developers to come to the table to deliver, and they'll also be responding to the towards document. It'd be interesting to see what some of the players in the market say about delivery, although often it's in their interest to have more capacity in the system. And then on your second point about kind of local transport and infrastructure more generally, that it's a key point. And I suppose the London plan talks about the big transport investment pieces. It doesn't talk so much about the kind of local level. So I think that is an area that then is sort of left to the local authorities to plan for, which we do through our local plans and through, as we're taking through at the moment, the community infrastructure levy and through 106. But that bigger understanding of how if places are going to grow a lot, how we make sure we have that infrastructure, I think is something that we've kind of raised in our response, that actually social infrastructure in particular is seen as, it feels a little bit like it's a second thought, whereas we know, and that's probably my interpretation, so it may not be fair interpretation of the towards document, but that we know it's so important for our residents and communities that it has to be front and centre, and that links to our kind of connected community 20-minute neighbourhood sort of approach that we've got in our plan, making sure that we've got all the things that people need within their kind of local area.
Councillor Sharma.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. That was very informative. You've already sort of answered the question one of the questions I had, which is, will there be additional investment in public transport, roads, cycling and walking routes to support higher density? And then I had some other questions as well. Do you want those now, or do you want to just continue with this one first? Just carry. Okay. Well, are the proposed housing targets for Ealing realistic and deliverable, given our current infrastructure, land supply, and there's some local resistance to overdevelopment? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, in terms of infrastructure, transport in particular, So there's a couple of ways that we get funding. I mentioned community infrastructure levy, which we don't have in place at the moment, but we're going through the process of introducing that. Section 106, which comes through specific schemes, and then also TfL funding, which went down quite a lot during the pandemic and hopefully kind of will increase over time. There are also kind of specific schemes within the London Plan that are particularly relevant. So the West London Orbital scheme is still mentioned as one that they're pursuing. Obviously, we've had investment through the Elizabeth line. We know that the GLA is kind of very focused on active travel, and that's, you know, can support development in many ways as well. But exactly, so what the London Plan will do is we'll probably set out what kind of investment in that regard is needed across London, but exactly how that's paid for is sometimes a question. So that's often kind of this part they'll be looking at, I guess, what needs to be delivered to unlock that density, and then also how that can be funded, and that is quite tricky, because particularly where you've got, if you are relying on community infrastructure levy or section 106, then there's a timing piece, isn't there, about when you get the money in and then when you deliver that infrastructure. On the second point about the housing targets, we don't have a housing target at the moment. So even though the government standard method does come up with a figure for Ealing, because actually the overall number is then distributed via the London Plan process, we don't know what that figure will be yet. We are assuming that it will be more than we've got at the moment. And right now, housing delivery is not great. So it is quite a challenge, and it comes back to the discussion before about, you know, how much developers, as well as, you know, we can do the planning, we can approve applications, but in the end developers have to build it out.
Councillor Conti.
Thank you. I had two questions. One was on sort of building on green space, and so I guess there's two separate things. One about building on green belt, but also then you obviously mentioned about the protection or no plans to change around metropolitan open land, apart from potentially golf courses. I just wonder, because obviously in Ealing we have metropolitan open land. I don't know if there's any actually green belt sites in there as well. I wonder what what the impact you envisage of those particular changes could be on the borough. And I guess how you balance that out, because obviously there's quite a big sort of green agenda from the council in terms of rewilding, you know, the regional park, all of those things. How do you balance out the requirements for building and potentially, you know, guidance from the new London Plan that actually we should be building in green space, whether irrespective of people's opinion on that, and how we balance that off with those other competing priorities. And the second thing was just really just a bit more sort of on the infrastructure point, I guess, in terms of how that joins up between the section 106 money that's paid, the money the council gets, and how, because often some of that infrastructure isn't stuff that's delivered directly by the council. So whether it's health services, etc. I brought up a health scrutiny about 6 months ago because there was discussion about we ended up discussing it, and there was a really disjointed feeling between local NHS services and the local NHS and what happens with section 106 money. And, you know, for example, you know, this very tiny bit of the example I'm using in my ward, but in Hanger Hill, around the gyratory, you've got Westgate House, which has over 200 flats in the last few years. You've got the development, the student accommodation, the centre, which again will be hundreds of units, and Twyford Abbey, which again will be another 300 or so units. And, you know, essentially you have in the next few years thousands of additional residents there, but there's no plan for any additional GP services or practices. You know, there's no plan for any additional trains at Hanger Lane Station. You know, no additional buses. You know, so what does that actually mean, infrastructure? Because there's all these big developments. You know, there's a few £100,000 here or £50,000 there for these things, but does it actually materialise, deliver, you know, tangible changes in infrastructure? And I think from a particular examples in the ward I represent, people don't feel that it does.
So on the Greenbelt point, so the GLA, as I mentioned, are doing a Greenbelt review. We are kind of involved in that, so we kind of understand some of the methodology. But their first is a sift of kind of looking at what's out there. And then what they then decide or propose in terms of release or what's grey belt or where development might happen, we're nowhere near that now. So we don't know yet. I guess in terms of that mix between Greenbelt and MOL, we've got some Greenbelt to the west of the borough, really, and the rest of our big green spaces is mainly MOL. I might bring Stephen in a minute because he has a lot of experience on the Greenbelt and MOL question in the borough. So it's kind of still early days to see what that looks like. And it might be that there's focused in particular part of London, or the kind of new town idea where it's, you know, in just one or two places within London, and it's not sort of London wide. So we still don't really know. In terms of that point about the general kind of making sure that we retain biodiversity, there are the sort of policies like the biodiversity net gain, urban green factor, to make sure that when you are developing somewhere that you are still putting in that you know, natural environment. And I think the importance of open space for recreation, for amenity in terms of balconies or sort of green open space as part of development is key, and we'd want to make sure that comes through in any kind of policies. Steve, did you want to come in a bit?
Just to set things in context, because the councillor raised questions about numbers. Our current housing supply target is 2,157 net additional units per annum. Under the new standard method, Ealing is apportioned a target of 3,407, so more than 50% increase. So if you see that in the context of London's overall targets going up from just over 50,000 to almost 90,000, that is perhaps understandable. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that will be the target that we will get, because as Jen has already explained, the work that's being done by colleagues at City Hall with input from all of the boroughs is to look at what the capacity is across London. And I should just say, it's an obvious point, and perhaps Jen was reluctant to sort of blow her own trumpet as a former head of the London Plan team. We should remember we're lucky to have strategic planning in London. It's being reinvented in the rest of England. So whilst we don't always have a perfect relationship with the mayor, we often have disagreements and emphasis in terms of policy. If you speak to my colleagues up and down the country across the rest of England, the challenge of trying to do some of these big planning issues without a strategic planning authority, look at Horsham, look at Mid Sussex, just look at some of the recent press in the last week where they've hit the buffers on duty to cooperate, for example. We are fortunate to have the mechanism that we have, and it's stood us well. Despite my age, I'm old enough to remember when the GLC was abolished and we had something called the London Planning Advisory Committee, and we used to get 33 leaders of the councils across London sit around a table trying to agree strategic matters for the whole of the capital. And let me tell you, it was an absolute nightmare. It's probably the worst point in my career. So we weren't actually able to get a lot of this stuff done in terms of planning for infrastructure and the rest of it. But coming back to your question, which is a really good question, the mayor's got a real challenge, hasn't he? Because we know the scale of the high housing crisis, and the government has set this massive national house building target for the whole of England, and no part of the country has been spared. In most cases, it's going to be a steep increase, so we're not being singled out for unfair treatment. So if you think about where the traditional sources of supply might come from, obviously the London Plan emphasises brownfield first. Clearly, obviously, you're looking at previously developed land as your major source. But to be quite frank, we've done London-wide SLAs and assessments of capacity in London now for many, many years, and you're still probably looking at the same reservoir of brownfield sites. They haven't really changed. Some of those obviously have been developed or are in the process of being developed, such as the gasworks, although, as we'll come on to discuss later, with notoriously slow build-out rates. And that's all because of the rationing by private developers of new housing to keep prices high. And that's obviously something which the government is keen to challenge. We'll come on to that in a moment. So brownfield first, obviously, that's a good starting point. But I think in terms of the step change that's required in London, yes, we can squeeze a bit more supply out of that, but it's not going to get us anywhere close to the target. Another policy emphasis has been on small sites. And again, particularly with the excellent work that's been done around design codes led by government, but also by the mayor and pioneering work, innovative work by some of the local authorities, and we've got our own character study and housing design guide. Yes, you can see again an increase in supply under the right conditions, but again, it's not going to get you anywhere close. So there are two other possibilities. One is something which is linked to infrastructure, and the Elizabeth line shows that a big shiny physical infrastructure project that delivers, and there are examples which haven't, can be a game changer. We know even before the Elizabeth line opened in Ealing, the catalytic effect in terms of growth and development, particularly on Acton, Ealing Broadway, and especially Southall, was quite phenomenal. And even before the line opened, developers were assembling land and positioning themselves to get ready for the expected bonus in terms of improved connectivity and improved journey times. Of course, the government has inherited a huge backlog of infrastructure projects. We haven't built a reservoir in this country for 30 years. There are now plans to build 4 and go on through the list. There's a big scale, there's a big long list of investment that needs to be invested in. And of course, the government's policy, so far as I understand it, is also to try and ensure there is some redistribution in terms of growth and investment, particularly towards the north, where there is the perception that they have not always received the same focus and funding that London and the South East has got. So the mayor has very ambitious plans for physical transport, and whilst government has announced a spending review in recent weeks for the rest of the country, the position in terms of London is reserved. So the sorts of projects that have been talked about in the past included Crossrail 2. I think it's unlikely that will come forward because of the scale and cost, and probably won't deliver the sort of growth and development, certainly in terms of housing, quick enough. Because we were talking about Elizabeth line, Crossrail 1. When I was a trainee in a planning department, it's taken me almost my entire career to actually see the bloody thing built. There's talks about extensions to Bakerloo line, further extensions to Docklands, Light Railway. One scheme was being promoted very heavily last week in terms of an extension to Thamesmead, for example, possibly also including another crossing over the River Thames. Whether or not any of those schemes will be funded will be largely dependent on what government funding is available to the mayor. Certainly the most critical project in our part of the world is probably the West London Orbital Railway, which Jen referred to. My own view is that that will have a catalytic effect in terms of bringing forward housing that probably would come forward in our borough anyway, particularly around the South Acton estate. Where I think it's likely to make a difference will be where we're looking at opportunities for industrial intensification and some of our locally significant industrial sites, which I think without that investment, they may be more marginal in terms of viability and attractiveness. So infrastructure could squeeze some additional development. There is a problem with that because of the time lag between deciding we're going to provide this nice new shiny project and it then being delivered. If you then set the housing target on the basis of what the infrastructure might deliver early, then you're burdening that local authority with a target which actually can't be met because it's dependent on the infrastructure being provided. Yes, you can have some lead-in time, as the Elizabeth line showed, but if you look at, say, Barnet, for example, they were set very, very high housing targets, but the infrastructure they were promised, it never came. So they never got any, they didn't get close to meeting their targets. So I think infrastructure, depending on what investment is provided, could make a difference. I still don't think it's going to get you close to your target. So the only show in town is probably Greenbelt Release. And I have to say, it's taken a while, but the mayor's finally come round to this way of thinking, and it's quite a brave decision because for politicians it's not a popular decision to review the Greenbelt. I would make the point that the sort of bucolic image of Greenbelt in popular imagination is not always correct. A lot of Greenbelt actually isn't even covered in greenery. Some of it is agricultural land, a lot of it is land that's not accessible, has limited value in terms of quality for recreation and so forth. But you have to remember what the purpose of Greenbelt. The purpose of Greenbelt primarily was to separate settlements, and it's probably, in terms of all of the policies that arose from the Town and Country Planning Act, probably the most successful planning policy that was invented in the UK planning system. And if you see the scale and size of the Greenbelt, it is quite enormous. And it's actually had unintended consequences, because by having that girdle around the major cities, particularly London, it has had unintended consequences to the extent that development then has had to move across the green belt to provide development opportunities. So you have that gap, and it's not necessarily always contributing to the principles of sustainability. So part of the thinking, I think, in government circles is that if we were to sacrifice a small percentage of the green belt, given the scale of our housing crisis, that then might provide the opportunity, the land, to try and make the difference that is needed to meet London's housing requirements. Now, how you do that and which bits of greenbelt get released, to be determined. As Jen has also indicated, there is a lot of work going on around new towns and urban extensions, the possibility up to 4 new towns within the Greater London boundary. And one has even been suggested for West London, although not within the confines of the London Borough of Ealing, you'll be perhaps relieved to learn. So it's going to be a debate that's going to run and run. We're at the very early stages in terms of the Greenbelt Review. In fact, we only had a meeting today with the consultants and with officers at GLA to look at some of their initial thoughts. We made substantial comment on the methodology because there were clearly flaws or things which we felt needed clarification. And I think, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that will provide part of the strategic evidence base for London. But actually, it will be left to us in Ealing and each of the local planning authorities affected to make final decisions, because the mayor can't actually determine the green belt boundaries finally. It'll be a matter for us in our local plans. So, this is the beginning of a process, not an end. But I would perhaps suggest to you keep an open mind, because the scale of the challenge is so great. There is not much opportunity of us being able to meet the challenge unless we are looking outside the box.
Councillor Mahmood.
This is exactly what my question was, that 2 questions. And when you said when you said continuously it's not possible to achieve the target which we have been targeted. So what do you think, how we can identify the problem? Is it why we are not achieving much housing supply because of planning system, or is that the reason of a broken housing market? Possibly we need to identify that, how we can go forward, reform the planning system or repair the broken housing market. I'm just trying to understand where we are, or is it the element of both? And the second thing is, since I was involved in planning for 15 years, I always very much passionate about Orbital, West London Orbital, because there's a connection is missing between west to south or south to west. And I think it should be on the top of the agenda while we are talking about transport infrastructure. And I'm sure we will be covering. So how we can push that thing, that's I want to know. It's very vital link, and it will be, I think it will, while we are doing OPDC development plan as well, and that's the link between Hounslow to Brent Cross, including OPDC as well, which is, we are talking about 30 or 40,000 homes. So this is a very interesting time when London development plan, our local development plan will be embedded together, and we can deliver West London Orbital. Thank you.
Thanks. So on delivery, I suppose our current target that we've got in the existing London plan, we're not delivering at the moment, is the case. And I think there's a whole host of different reasons for that. And I think there has been a narrative around the planning system being a big part of the problem. as a planner, you won't be surprised that I don't entirely agree that it is the biggest part of the problem, although it is in some places. I think in London and in particular Ealing, you know, we've got a good attitude to growth and development and ensuring good growth. So schemes, you know, we give a lot of permissions. We make sure that those permissions are robust and that they're delivering the development that we need. But I think we've seen over the last few years, I mean, obviously you've had a whole raft of different things. We've had COVID, we've had issues with kind of mortgages, the market, wars, you know, so many things have that impact on development, and it has slowed down a lot. And I don't think whatever planning system you had would make so much of a difference about that. I think at the moment it's an economic market issue. We've also had other things such as the you know, the new process has been brought in for absolutely the right reasons in terms of fire safety, but because they're new and there was some uncertainty. So for a while there was kind of uncertainty about when you'd need 2 staircases, for example. Was it 18 metres? Was it 30? There's been that uncertainty. We've had schemes had to come in and be redesigned because of that, you know, rightly to accommodate it, but it slows things down. It takes time, it adds cost. Some developers just think I'm not going to bother anymore. And then you've also got the more general Building Safety Act and having to go through the gateways, which has slowed things down as well. So I think it's almost like a perfect storm of different issues that has slowed down delivery. But also, if you're looking back further and the sort of numbers we're talking about, I think we've mentioned, or certainly me and Steve were discussing, I think maybe once in the history of house building has any of these numbers ever been delivered, and that's been when there's been a lot of public money going into housing delivery, which, or you know, the comprehensive spending review a couple of weeks ago was positive, so that's good. But whether it's enough to kind of make up for, you know, the homes that we need, a lot of the homes that we need in Ealing and across London are affordable homes, you know. So we, you know, to deliver those, obviously through 106s and developers delivering some, we get some, but actually to really deliver what we need, it is public money that, you know, I think is needed. So I think all of that. So I think I wouldn't say that Ealing, you know, in a London context or in an England context, is doing particularly badly at the moment. It's just the issues that everyone's dealing with, I would say. I don't know if you want to come in about the West London Orbital.
Can I just add a little bit to that, if I may, Chair? So yes, the planning system did need reform, and probably the biggest reform was the restoration of strategic planning. But we've had that in London, and we've still not hit the targets the Mayor has been set now, and there will be major challenges to meet the new targets. So there obviously needs to be a step change in the way in which we approach the whole issue of delivery. And I think some of the metrics are the wrong ones, because through the housing delivery test, what we're basically measuring is housing completions. And then it's your planning departments which are then being penalised. So unless Jen sends me out to do some bricklaying or some plastering, I'm not sure what else I can do, because if you look at the pipeline of approvals and consents, both in this borough and across London, and then you see what's actually built, there's a huge mismatch. So some work that was done when Jen was at the City Hall, I think, by Molière, 2 studies, which said at various points in time, anything from 1/3 to 1/2 of planning applications are obtained by agents or their developers with a track record of building nothing, purely speculative, which of course, you know, is hugely disappointing. So, you know, how can we ensure that developers build? We're going to come on to that, I think, in the next half of this meeting. But if you look at historical building patterns, the private sector has rarely delivered the last couple of decades more than 150,000 homes per annum, and that would be peak. So you've had, you know, build out rates painfully low. To see sort of delivery rates where there was more balance, you'd have to go back several decades, and that's when there was a major council house building programme. And of course, with the demise of council construction teams and with the sell-off of council homes, our contribution in the marketplace is more significant now than it ever has been, but it's tiny by comparison. And of course, then you have the third sector, which is the registered social landlords, and their contribution tends to ebb and flow depending on the sources of funding that are available from government. So you have a mismatch in the housing market in terms of how homes are financed and how they are built. But it's the local authorities, your local planning authorities, which are penalised if we're not meeting a completion target. Whereas actually what we can influence is the rates of approvals and consents. And it's, you know, people around this table at planning committee who are making a huge contribution towards that. But you don't go out and build these homes. But that's the metric. And it has an unforeseen consequence. And, you know, some developers, I think, are quite keen to capitalise on this, that if you're not meeting your housing delivery targets, then they can seek to overturn decisions that planning committee or officers have made on consents at appeal to say that because you're not meeting your housing targets, therefore they should have your decision to refuse overturned. And that's increasingly happening, particularly in the current marketplace. There are green shoots. I think, you know, the reforms that have been proposed are beginning to see a turn corner. We're beginning to see some upturn in activity. But, you know, there are only green shoots at the moment. I wouldn't say that we're going to get to where we need to be without some other changes to the marketplace. I'm sorry, and then there was a question on infrastructure. Sorry, I almost forgot. So I'm very pleased, Councillor, you supported West London Orbital. It was a key part of the emerging local plan in terms of one of our key infrastructure projects. It obviously has the support of neighbouring authorities, notably Hounslow, OPDC, Brent, and of course Barnet. And you're right, it extends currently. The proposal is it would extend from Hounslow up to Brent Cross. There was a proposal for a further branch line potentially to Cricklewood and West Hampstead. My understanding is that has probably been mothballed for the time being to make the scheme more affordable, and because of depot capacity at Cricklewood Station. But all of the feasibility study work that has been done hitherto, jointly between the boroughs, but particularly with TfL and the GLA family, have shown the scheme is feasible and is very cost effective. And for a railway scheme, because most of the track exists, bar one short piece of track which would need to join up the two halves of the line, if you like, you actually have a lot of the infrastructure built. Obviously, you will have the additional burden of refurbishing stations, and in Ealing there is a challenge of two-level crossings which will need to be navigated. So there are going to be some challenges in terms of delivery. But if you compare the cost of this scheme compared to, say, Crossrail or Crossrail 2, and especially High Speed 2, it's an extremely cost-effective programme. So at the moment we're going through the further engineering feasibility work. That work's advanced. Obviously, we're now working with TfL. TfL, at the height of COVID, said there's no money. And in fairness to them, they didn't know whether they had enough money to get them through the end of the week, the end of the month, never mind planning for an infrastructure project 5-10 years hence. They're saying they'll contribute a third of the money. We understand the government is looking to put in up to a third, which leaves another third to be found either through planning obligations or from some other funding source. So still some way to go, but you know, that's a lot more encouraging. So very, very pleased that the London Plan team continues to support the project. It's likely to be included in the London Plan, and we've certainly lobbied for its continued inclusion.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you. So it's worth mentioning that the Towards document makes the point about social rent being the key kind of tenure that we need. So I think we'd agree with that. Certainly is the case here in Ealing. In terms of the threshold, there's the talk about, so when it comes to the kind of discussions about Greenbelt on a national level, there's what's called the golden thread, which is saying if you are to release Greenbelt, if it's identified as grey belt, you'd have to deliver the 50%. Well, it's 15% above your current target, so it'd be 50% in London. But in terms of the London plan and that sort of current 35% threshold on most sites, I don't think they've come to a conclusion on that. And interestingly, last week when we were at our examination, and you'll know that in our emerging local plan we've got a 40% target, the GLA were there arguing against that and thinks we should keep it at 35% because of the current market and also because of a consistency across London is helpful. So I'm not clear whether they'll change it, to be honest, particularly if they're doing the evidence in the next year or so and the market feels tricky to increase that would be difficult. I think on shared ownership, I don't think it explored it too much. It did talk about key worker rent though, which I guess is an intermediate rental product, which might be better, might be more like sort of London living rent. Because I think certainly from obviously with the GLA group, you've got Housing and Land who deal with the sort of affordable housing funding. And I know that discussion about the utility of shared ownership is one that they have, and across London it becomes unaffordable quite quickly, you know, as soon as the values go up to a certain point, and particularly for larger units. So I think it will play into their thinking, but for some boroughs and some areas it does still work.
Okay, I'd like to ask, I think that's all the questions from, oh, sorry, Councillor Martin, sorry about that.
See if I can get this to work without making a bit of feedback, but you've half-assed answered one of my questions, which was about to be our own local plan. Does that match with the new the intentions within the new version of the London plan? I know it's quite early to tell that, but I think you're already getting indications about things like that. I mean, I've been interested to see on the other side of it as well, which was, I think, the environmental levy that we were talking about, if they're thinking along the same lines as we were, of increasing that quite a bit when people don't meet the targets for carbon reductions. You also mentioned at the beginning, I think, that there's been a submission, that we've made a submission because we're out of date. I'd be interested to see what our submission was. So maybe that could be shared with us for the next meeting. But in the more detailed version that we're also shared, there's some really interesting, I think, debates about types of housing that I think is something that would be useful for us to look at as well. Because we often wonder about things like that. I mean, student housing being an example. But also older people's housing and the sort of different types of tenure that could help people in very different circumstances. We know social rent is only going to be available for certain people. So what do we do? Where's the gap and how do we fill that gap? So there's a lot we could be discussing about it, but I kind of feel like we've slightly missed the boat anyway if we've missed the deadline, unless you're going to tell us there's some more points in which we can actually come in later.
Yeah, so in terms of that last point, yeah, I mean the Towards the London Plan consultation has closed, but they will still be engaging. I think there's no doubt in that. And also there will be a draft London Plan which we then can comment on. But I think yeah, you're right about the different kind of tenures and different types of development, and in fact that also links to the next item in terms of speeding up build out. In terms of the question about our plan and the London plan, it is probably a little bit early to tell, but I suppose in terms of housing numbers, that really big point, we do, if we can assume, which we're saying, the numbers in the London plan will be higher for Ealing than they than they currently are, then we will have to look at our plan quite quickly after that to see how we can accommodate that. And the point that Steve made, some of the things that the plan might set out won't actually come into effect until it's done in a local plan. But I think on a lot of areas, we're, you know, they're thinking on the same lines as we are. In terms of the kind of zero carbon and the approach to that, I think on that particular issue, we've responded to say, do what we're doing, because we think that's quite good. So, you know, that's something we can continue to lobby on. But I think this is where that balance will be really interesting, because you've got that the kind of environmental zero carbon requirements that we want to see to see good development that's long term and has at least the least impact on the environment that it can. But then this question about deliverability, viability, how do you deliver all these numbers? And I think that's a real tension that the London Plan is going to have to grapple with.
Councillor Mahmood, you want to come back?
Just to quickly, as Councillor Wall was asking about the different product and affordable threshold, there is another product called cap on the rent, and I have only seen in Ealing a couple of times when we dealing with that. It's more American product in terms of housing. So if the young couple or young people wanted to start their life and they have got some stability, 20 years cap on the rent or 10 years cap on the rent, so they could move their lives. So are we somewhere this product is existing, or what's the future of that?
So that it doesn't really exist. So I mean, there's the general discussion about rent caps, which happen in some countries and in some cities, but that isn't something the London Plan can really deal with, because that's a kind of private sector point. What can be done is through the kind of intermediate products, so discounted market rent or affordable rent, London living rent, so they can be capped at a certain level of the market. It doesn't tend to be so it doesn't tend to be means tested in that way, that, you know, you pay a certain amount once and then over time that amount goes up depending on your circumstance. That isn't a product that really exists at the moment. Yes, yeah.
Okay, Jen, if I could give you ask some questions. Right, so the Land for London programme has identified 700 sites. How many of those fall within the Ealing Borough? And also opportunity areas. I know there are 47 in London. Do we have any opportunity areas in Ealing? And finally, does the Towards document pay sufficient attention to economic growth and the role of West London in that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take them backwards if that's okay. So I think so. Our view is that the London Plan, so the discussion within the Towards document doesn't suggest that they're going to take enough account of the West London and our economy. So that's something that we've made a big point of. You'll know that there was the West London Alliance did some work on kind of polycentric development and about how, you know, if you promote growth within West London because of the kind of important sectors and industrial uses that we've got, then that's good for London as a whole. So I think things like the West Tech Corridor we'd like to see definitely in the London Plan. So I think it could do more. In terms of opportunity areas, and Steve might have to correct me, but we've got Southall at the moment and OPDC. Any others? That's it. So there's, I guess, a discussion about whether we'd want to see more. I think we could probably have a whole session on the history of Southall opportunity area, in terms of, you know, how successful or not we might think that has been. And then Land for London numbers, I'll have to hand to Steve on that.
I don't know off the top of my head. We're sifting and sorting through that now. So I think the number of sites isn't necessarily your guide, because some of those sites will be much larger than others. So it's probably an artificial metric.
Okay, if we can now move on to item number 8, which is a very important item in my opinion as well, because it's speeding up build out. Again, I'll pass this to Jennifer to present.
Thank you. I haven't actually got any slides for this one, so I'll just sort of talk you through it. So this one is a government consultation. It is still out to consultation, so we can pick up the discussion today and feed that into our response. But it's relevant and it's already come up a few times around kind of the government's done quite a lot of changes to the planning system to increase development. This is where they're looking at how do they make sure or help ensure that schemes are actually built out. So they've sort of put it in the terms of ensure that the right incentives exist in the housing market, and the local authorities, local planning authorities have the right tools to encourage homes to be built out more quickly. So there's a technical consultation and also this working paper, and it's useful because it kind of sets out quite early on that the Competition and Markets Authority and others have concluded that most homes in England are not built as fast as they could be, but it's actually they're just built only as fast as the developer expects to sell them at the kind of specific market price. And I think we all know that's the case, but it's good for government to kind of set that out. So that's why it can take particularly large sites decades for them to complete, and you know, across London we've seen that a lot. It also talks about the fact that there's kind of 3 interrelated things that sometimes get a bit confused, that there's land banks, which is kind of sometimes seen as a bit of a nasty word, but developers do have to have a pipeline of sites that they want to bring forward and develop on, and that's a normal part of the process. I think the concern comes is when they're not being bought out and they feel like they're just being kind of sat on, and that's where more transparency and information is needed about kind of what options developers might have on sites or how they're being progressed. So that's one of the points that they pick up on. There's delayed or stuck sites that might be anywhere within the planning process, or nowhere at all yet, but you know, they might have kind of stalled early. I mentioned around the Building Safety Act that things are getting a bit stalled getting through the gateway, so that could be a reason, or it could just be a whole host of kind of investment problems. And as a local authority, we try and have a look at that if we know that sites are stuck, to try and understand why it's stuck and what can be done to move it forward. And then there's the slow build out more generally as linked to the point which is called absorption rate. So that's basically how quickly homes can be sold for the price that a developer wants to sell them. So governments see that they need to be doing something to make sure that stuck sites become unstuck and that schemes aren't built out too slow. And they make the point, which is a bit trite in a way, but is important, you know, you can have as many planning permissions as you like, but no one can live in a planning permission. So it's important that we do get to that next point of delivery. So what they're trying to do, or what they're consulting on, is what can be done about that. So they talk about what impacts build out. They think that restrictiveness of local planning can restrict build out, and concentration of market power. So there's the idea there that that currently there's an incentive in the market to keep hold of sites and build them slowly or not at all, because the price and the value will keep going up. The more sites you have in the portfolio that could come forward, the less likely that will be a thing. We can come on to what we think about that, I guess, in the discussion, but that's the kind of the kind of idea. And then, of course, if you've only got a certain few players within the market, then they can kind of manage that, build out slowly. Whereas the more players you have, the more likely things are going to be built out. And that, you know, over time, there's been lots of different studies around some of those things, particularly about the diversity of market. I think it was Oliver Letwin did some work a few years ago that looked at all of this and absorption issues, and this sort of builds on that, actually. Obviously, local demand makes a difference. If people can't afford to buy, they're not going to buy, you know, things aren't going to get built. So availability of mortgages, income, etc. will impact it. Typologies, we know that flatted development gives you quite a lumpy build out because it all has to be built out once and then finished, unlike a kind of housing scheme that can be done in a kind of more sort of drip feed way. We haven't got so many small sites and SMEs in the system across the country. The more of those that you have, so small and medium enterprises building, the more likely things will happen. They don't have quite the same issues with absorption rates. Levels of affordable housing, we know that schemes that have a lot of affordable housing tend to build quickly, because obviously affordable housing doesn't have the same issue with absorption rates either. And then a range of tenures in terms of build to rent or students, co-living, etc., means that you're building for different markets. So again, can speed up build out, and that's what the government is thinking. So, they've obviously got the reforms to the planning system to try and bring more sites within to the system to add that capacity for delivery, support demand sustainably, they say. So think about how they support people to get access to the mortgages that they need to actually buy the properties or rent the properties. Support SMEs in building small sites, and some of that stuff we talked about in the last item around kind of identifying more small sites, having design codes, etc., can help those come forward. They talk about encouraging large strategic sites to build with greater tenure diversity. So maybe, and they actually discuss potentially requiring an element of build to rent, for example, on a scheme over, I think they're talking about 500 units. But other things like homes for older people, homes for students, all of those things, because it's different markets, in theory, could then be built more speedily over the build out. Then also they're looking at increasing the role for strategic master plans. This is around bringing kind of land holdings together, perhaps taking some of the risk as a local authority in terms of kind of utilities investment to bring stuff forward and make that happen. And that could be development corporations, or we have in London the mayoral development corporations, and kind of that parcelling up of sites. They're talking about the transparency and accountability measures, which is quite interesting for us. So this is around that developers would actually have to, as part of a planning permission, sort of set a build out timescale. So when they expect to build things out. They have to tell us when a development is started, and then also tell us when it's progressing and when it's completed. And that, for us would be super helpful, because at the moment we have to try and find that information, try and understand what's going on. And obviously we've no idea whether what they've built out is unusually slow or what they were planning all along. So I think that's really could be very useful. They've also suggested, so within the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, there's already the kind of possibility to potentially decline to determine an application based if the application is by a person who's applied for it who hasn't built out in the past in the borough, which is really interesting, I think. So you actually take their history of build out into account. Very tricky to actually work that, but I guess it gives that message around, we want you to deliver, which is really useful. I mentioned about the mixed tenure threshold, so they're looking at maybe over 500 units. You couldn't have a 1 tenure scheme, so it couldn't just be kind of build for sale. You'd have to add in that mixture. Also looking at CPO powers again, so if sites are stalled. So at the moment with the CPO, if you go through the process and the landowner says, well, we've got a scheme, we're going to deliver that, so the CPO fails. If they don't deliver, you have to start all over again. What they're saying is that the CPO would set the principle that actually a CPO would be a good idea. So if they don't build, then you just come back to that point. You don't have to start again, which obviously would be good for local authorities, and also good for actually ensuring that people aren't saying they're going to build out when actually they're not. So that also could be very useful. And then the other one, which is, I think, particularly interesting and maybe quite controversial for the development industry, is the delayed homes penalty. So this is where if you don't build out to the speed that had been agreed as part of that planning application, and there's no proper justification, and all of the exactly how that's set out will be key to this, but then there'd actually be some kind of financial penalty to those developers. So really gives them the incentive to actually build out, which at the moment we have very little any tools actually to make developers build out. So they're the key initiatives within there. There's a sort of whole list of questions as part of the consultation. So it'd be good, to have a chat about what people think.
Okay, Councillor Ward.
Just make sure this, right, no feedback. Right, the last part of that is quite the key to it, I think. It's financial penalties if they're not building out at speed, and if your part of the permission is to tell you what the speed they're building out at, and what, I mean, obviously there's always going to be issues around building out, as we've seen in the probably last 5 years or more, but that's just general. I mean, we could accept that. It's when you compare one to another is the issue, isn't it? As such as, I mean, for instance, Southall Green Quarter is, I remember when I started as a councillor, and that was on the agenda. So yeah, that's been very slow build out, but that for obviously financial reasons, and I understand that to a certain extent, but you know, the CPO bit is probably the end of the process, and it should be part of the planning permission as well. But in other words, if you're going to set a financial penalty if you don't build out in the timescales you're saying you're building out, and we would have, I imagine, some sort of mechanism for finding, for want of a better word, but the end of that process would be potentially CPOing it, and or using our own non-for-profit sort of company to start building as an alternative. Because if you're just going to take it away and then give it to the next developer, there's not a lot of big developers out there, so they're all going to play the same game. They're all going to, you know, come around and say, oh, I'll buy that one off you and you buy that one off me. Almost a cartel. I'm not saying there's a cartel. I know, but there could potentially be a cartel on it. So it's thinking cleverly and trying to break that cycle is where I'm thinking.
So I think it is a really interesting one, and I think so those big schemes, and the Gasworks is a good example that builds out over very many years. It is a lot of units though, so you kind of understand that. And I guess what will be interesting in terms of kind of developers like Barclays and other big developers in terms of their response to this is, you know, they're probably, this is their model, that's how they do it. It's a slow build out, but I suppose even just having this consultation puts that emphasis onto developers to say, actually, you should be speeding that up. And even if that's all that happens, I think that is important, because we, at the moment, as a local authority, we just have to accept. And in fact, we had an interesting exchange last week at the examination with Barclays saying that we'd overestimated how quickly that we thought they would build out, even though we'd got it from one of their own applications. But that there's that there's a slightly perverse logic there, because then they can argue, well, we're building out very slowly, so you don't have a 5-year land supply, so you've got to find more sites. So it feels like there is this extra tool is needed to try and stop that happening. But you're right, in terms of exactly how it works will be key, because otherwise it will be gamed. And really it's the sort of thing that you don't ever want to have to use. It's just having that threat is helpful.
Councillor Sharma.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to the point on diversity and tenure mix. So should Ealing consider mandating a mix of tenures, such as social rent, shared ownership or private, on large sites to encourage quicker build out? And the other question is, would promoting build to rent or co-living schemes align with faster delivery expectations?
So on the first question, we do. I mean, we do require a mix, because we ask for the 35% affordable, and we require that at the moment 60% as kind of low cost rent, so either shared, either social rent or London affordable rent, and then 40% as intermediate, so shared ownership or intermediate rent. And our new plan is proposing a 70-30, so more of the low cost rented. So we do already have that tenure mix, and I think that is important. I think where where this proposal is going slightly further, and it comes to your second question, is whether you also mandate on certain schemes an element of build to rent, for example, or older persons accommodation or co-living. I think with build to rent, it does tend to be built out quicker because obviously it makes sense. They need to get people in it, paying rent. You know, it's different to for sale. And also, particularly, I would say in London, there's such an appetite for rented accommodation that it's unlikely to sit empty for long. Whereas sometimes houses for sale can sit there for longer, depending on people's access to mortgages and things. So I think it could help. I think co-living and students, it will depend on the location. I think we're seeing a lot of applications of that type coming in. I think that makes us a little bit nervous, because what about kind of making sure that we have the proper C3 housing? But actually, as a mix, it can be quite good, and it can add that variety to a bigger scheme, and can work that way, probably better than a standalone big co-living scheme. But I think I'd be nervous about mandating a particular type of mix or a particular scale, because it might just add a complexity, particularly where you've got an applicant who might be quite good at building out and they don't necessarily do any of those mix of tenures, and then you're asking them to get someone else on board, and it might not help. But I think a general encouragement to make sure people look at, like, we're quite keen on build to rent because it is something that can build out, as long as it was also delivering the right affordable housing, so social rent.
Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I like the idea of the delayed homes penalty, but I just wonder how high it would have to be to have any actual impact. It might give us some income, regardless, but I just wonder if it's just going to be too low to make any difference to them, and whether or not there is anything else we might want to put in ourselves instead. What I'd love to do is tell them, okay, the 35% affordable housing will have to be 40 if you've not, you know, met your deadline. But you know, I don't know if that's a viable option, but there might be something else we can do that would really do something that gives us not just a bit more extra money, really.
Yeah, so coming to that, I guess actually it's quite interesting. So the threshold approach to affordable housing, so that 35% or 40%, and as you know, an applicant can deliver that up front or have that as part of their application, or they can go down the viability tested route, and then if they do go down the viability tested route and then they have a late stage review, that can be up to 50% affordable over time. And actually, it's both either scheme, whether you go down the threshold of the fast track or the viability tested, you have an early stage review. In the current market, doesn't quite work in the way that it was meant to be. When that was brought in, that was envisaged to do just that, really, to make sure that you have to get, if you haven't got to a certain point in your build out within the 2 years, you get that reviewed and you might have to pay more affordable. So that was that kind of thinking. So it's whether we could look at taking that further. I guess the only the reason why that might not work, and it also links to your point around the delayed homes penalty, is sort of protracted negotiations. Because if you've got to that point and then they say, well, actually, I can't afford anything now, or, you know, we'll have to do another viability test. And that's, I think, the question about how much the delayed homes penalty would need to be an actual kind of penalty is a good one. Like, yeah, I'm not sure what that would be pitched at. And then there's also the point, well, who is the arbiter of whether it was a genuine delay? How do those negotiations get mediated? Does that in itself slow things down because you spend your time arguing over that and not delivering? So I think there are a lot of things to iron out. But that idea on the kind of, you know, another trigger for almost the review mechanism, and maybe you just say it's not to do with viability, it's just you get a 5% extra affordable penalty if you haven't been built out, is, yeah, something we might suggest.
In terms of what the delayed homes penalty might be, what the consultation says, penalties could be based on a percentage of the house price or via reference to local council tax rates, given the loss of income that local authority incurs when homes are not built and occupied at the expected rate. So that's the sort of suggestions from government in the consultation paper.
Councillor Mahmood.
Thank you. This is exactly, I want to understand basically first the proposal, you are updating us in the future, that would be the part of the London plan, or that would be part of our local development plan, or would that be the part of our planning development framework? That I wanted a clarification from you. And from my personal point of view, it will be very difficult before we implement that, because there could be a lots of elements involved in delaying and delivering the homes. For example, at this moment of the time, all the facts and figures are showing the building regulation really hit that delay. So do we have any positive tools to mitigate that delay? For example, currently building regulation, which is a big pause. We all know that. I just wanted you to know how we could implement that if building regulation and other elements will be the causing to be delivered homes. Thank you.
So in terms of the speeding up build out is a government consultation. So it's a mixture of national legislation which already exists through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, and extra things that they're talking about bringing in through either kind of regulations linked to that or policy. So that would all be national, and we're just feeding into that. There's potential, I suppose, if we felt that we had ideas that they didn't take on, like the one Councillor Martin just mentioned, if we were going to explore something like that, it would be probably next plan type of thing that we'd need, the sort of time scale that we'd need to look at. In terms of, I mean, we know that the kind of gateway process as part of the Building Safety Act is slowing things down, but that's reliant on the health and safety regulator, which is a national building safety regulator, sorry, which is a national body. We don't have any kind of control about that. I know that a lot of developers are lobbying government about it to try and make sure they've got the right expertise in place. And I suppose that the government, I imagine a lot of responses to this consultation will raise that, as that's one of the big delays at the moment. So they will have to factor that in. And I think in the consultation they are talking about it's reasonable. So if you had, a bad year, a year with really bad weather, for example, that meant you just couldn't get on site, then that would have to be taken into account. So it's, and yeah, exactly. But it does make it difficult to judge, what's a reasonable delay and what isn't. And that will be the art of this is probably the first stage of consultation on this. I imagine that if they move it forward, there'll be a more detailed consultation as well.
Councillor Conti.
Thank you. Sometimes with sort of these large developments on planning, we see that the same application comes back again to add like an extra few stories or to increase density, and that, I guess, in one way can slow these applications down. I just wonder whether there's any mechanism to try and encourage developers to come to the table with the actual development they want to see initially, rather than this sort of like piecemeal approach to the way that they sometimes, not all of them, but sometimes they deal with these applications.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think so we do try and encourage developers to come with their plans. We know, without naming names, but some developers, it is a bit of a tactic that they use, because they'll meet a requirement, particularly in terms of height, and then they'll come back. Not very much we can do about that. We have to assess the applications as they come in. So yeah, there's not too much that can be done, but I guess it's being clear about what's acceptable, and that's where actually the local plan comes in and is helpful, because if you're clear about what's actually acceptable in a scheme, yeah, not too much you can do. But I guess in terms of the cost of the process, that sometimes will deter applicants. But it's a good point in terms of they might come in and renegotiate that build out time to always avoid it. So that's a good loophole to point out, that we can do that in our response.
Councillor Wall.
don't know how to phrase this, because I'm not, we must be able to do things better ourselves as a council in terms of planning, and not just the you know, the journey towards the planning application, but post planning application, because I know that we've had complaints about how long it takes to get the legal agreements in place, etc. And I think that probably is mirrored across the country, better or worse. But you know, from the date the application goes in, and I'm talking, you know, and it's not just the big ones, it's, you know, the small medium enterprises, that they struggle with that much more than the big ones, because they plan that, they know what that entails and how much it's going to cost them, they factor that in. But if you want to encourage, and we do want to encourage small and medium developers, then we should make it a lot easier and actually help them through the process, certainly until they're used to the process, which will not add costs to the end, which will inflate the costs of the or make them stall, or make them, you know, not actually build it out and then flip it to someone else, and etc., and just prolongate everything. So I think there's things we can do in the public sector and the council that can make that happen much better.
So linking to your potential item for future meetings, we can look at performance like that, and actually it's something that we as a team are looking at, because we're aware of that as well, that it can get stuck at that point. I have to be remiss of me not to say that although sometimes, you know, and oftentimes maybe it's a kind of local authority issue, it also gets stuck on the other side, and the negotiation, you know, gets slowed down from developers. Yeah, but I do think as well, the other thing that we're looking at, which goes to your other point around seeing what kind of how-to kind of guides we could help, you know, particularly householders or those very small developers. How do we help them navigate what is now a very complex system? So I think that is on our radar, but it would be good to, yeah, perhaps have a session looking at, you know, where the performance and perhaps where those areas of improvement could be picked up. Another thing that we're looking at is whether we can do more template 106s, for example. So they're just on the website, you pick them up, you haven't got to go through that negotiation.
Sorry, do we talk to small builders? You know, is there a mechanism for the council to? I know we talk to residents all the time, and we talk to, I'm sure we talk to the bigger players, but do we talk to the small builders?
I don't, certainly from a planning perspective, I don't think we have a particular forum, so that might be something we could have a look at, even if it's kind of a virtual forum to bring people together.
Okay, I think that's all the questions from the committee. Actually, I'd like to ask two questions. Is there anything else we could propose to the government to help build out? And my second question is, how does the comprehensive spending review announcement of more money for affordable housing help delivery?
I'll take the first one, and then maybe Steve can be thinking about sorry, I'll take the second one and Steve can be thinking about the first. On this, yeah, in terms of the comprehensive spending review, I think it will help a lot. Firstly, one of the issues that we're seeing that does impact build out is the fact that registered providers, because they didn't really have the money to invest in new stock because of investing in building safety issues and damp and mold, which is extremely important, but they couldn't do that and invest in new stock. There wasn't actually, or we were hearing that they weren't bidding for 106 units, for example. So that has slowed things down as well, because that money helps fund developers and ensure those schemes are built. So I think that will help in that regard. It will also help because some of these RPs will have their own building programs, and you know, they might be doing kind of particular bigger developments, estate regens across London. So I think there's definitely it's definitely likely that will help build out. In terms of other things we could suggest, well, actually, one of the things I would pick up on, which is a point that Steve sort of already made, but is around the delivery tests and how that works. So at the moment it's about completions, but it's the local authority who essentially get penalised. But something around removing that slightly odd incentive that a developer with a lot of land holdings or who wants a lot of land holding might have to actually slow development to get more land into the system, I think could be useful. So we could have a think about how we phrase that. But I don't know, Steve.
I think the scope and range of the planning reforms are incredible at the moment. I mean, you know, many of these changes are long overdue, particularly as I highlighted earlier in terms of strategic planning. There's a sense in terms of what the government's been saying around build out rates and, you know, the penalties and all the rest of it is, look, we've done our bit in terms of reforms of the planning system, and they're almost like throwing down the gauntlet now to the development industry. You've got to step up. I think one of the problems that has always beset the industry is the constant change. So when these changes do work for the system, we need a period of stability, because what developers will say is that where there are so many moving parts, and if you think about the scale of the changes we've got now, you know, we've got new standard method, we've got a new national planning policy framework going to come in. We've already had 2 in the last 12 months. We've got new national development management policies, which could potentially gut local plans and the London plan, because many of those policies will be set centrally. I suspect it won't be, because the devil will be in the detail, and particularly in London, we will argue probably that having a set of policies which applies everywhere from Durham to Cornwall to Kent, a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. And even within London, very distinct challenges and opportunities in West London compared to, say, East London. But, you know, we don't know the detail of that yet. That's going to be really, really important. Obviously, we're going to have a new strategic development strategy for London, the London Plan, which is going to set new metrics, not just for housing. Pleased to say it looks like we're going to see some progress on jobs and rebalancing, if you like, in terms of the planning scales. We don't know what the infrastructure investment programme is going to be. Lots of big ideas, but not an awful lot of money to pay for a lot of these things. And as rightly said by many members of this committee, if you're going to have genuine sustainable communities, you've got to have that balancing of the homes and the infrastructure to support that growth and development. I would just say the planning system often gets the blame, though, because there's only so much the planning system can pay towards new infrastructure through planning obligations. The funding gap is huge, and it certainly can't support what I would call day-to-day spending. So, you know, the point about GPs, for example, that is money that's raised through taxes and through other regimes. Not when we can pay for a new GP building, you know, or a health centre, but we can't pay for the lecky bill and the staff, you know, to service that function. So, you know, we often get the blame, but actually there are limits to what the planning system can do, and I don't think people always recognise that. And I think it's also about having the right metrics. So it's Jen's point. We're quite a convenient scapegoat, and I've got broad shoulders, so that's fine. But the reality is we can only deliver what's in front of us. You know, we can, and, you know, we work with you as members of the planning committee where appropriate. We can consent schemes, but we aren't, unless we're the developer ourselves, we don't build them. And so there is an unintended consequence of the system at the moment where it penalises local authorities like Ealing, who have a pro-growth agenda and are doing their level best to try and deal with some of these issues. But then it comes back at us like a boomerang, and we're then penalised because the market has failed. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how this debate unfolds, because everything has been concentrated on the planning system so far. And to be fair, some quite significant investment, particularly around money for infrastructure and affordable housing and the like. But, you know, we now need the development industry to step up.
Okay, I'd like to say thank you to our 2 speakers today. Thank you very much. You've been very informative. Okay, the date of the next meeting is the 26th of November, 2025. Thank you for attending. Good evening.